Yes, good morning. Good morning, AP Euro guys. I am sorry that I'm later than usual. Broadcasting from home is not quite as simple as one might think it is. Before we get started, of course, I want, of course, to introduce you to my technical crew. Standing behind me, to my left, your right, Senora Horton with the big heart on her chest, and Senor Horton, the only person that I allow to wear a hood indoors. But that's because he's British. If you can get a close up of him, wears the British flag. Yes, this is coming from Casa de Horton. And today we continue our discussion of the end of World War One. But before we get into that, just a few preliminaries. Yes, I think that it was an interesting announcement that was made yesterday that the state of Ohio basically is going on lockdown, the whole state. Will that happen to us in Kentucky? I think that there's a better than average chance that could be very well happen here. It's just a matter of when. Announcement number two, please don't think that I have the coronavirus, but my allergies are just beating me severely. I'm sneezing a whole lot, and you may have to get used to that. But since I'm sneezing, of course, I have plenty of this to go. Although I may need to ask Senor Horton to get me another one of these. Because I've been working all morning, as you saw from my email that I sent you. Yes, my email I sent you, I sent two emails. The first one, for some reason, my computer decided not to work. What is it they say about technology? It's great until it doesn't work. Well, this morning, in the middle of a rather long email, it decided to not work. And so, three. How about a joke? So, what's the difference between the Ryle administration and the Keystone Cops? I'll give you 3 seconds. Answer: Keystone Cops don't write you up or put you in Friday school. But I'm bummed. Anyway, oh, that was terrible. So how about this one? I follow a lot Mr. Ryan and Mr. Schaefer in the morning announcements. They've taken over the morning announcements now. You do know, of course, Mr. Ryan for a while tried the acting field. Yeah, he had a short life in acting, though. He lost the part of Groot in Guardians of the Galaxy. It seems that he could not remember the lines. Okay, enough jokes for today. I'm sure Mr. Ryan will want to get back with me on that one. But anyway, Mr. Dusing, I didn't tell a joke about you. How surprising. Don't worry, there's lots of time before the end of the year. And so, yeah, let's get started. I'm going to switch you off my screen, and I'll be looking at my screen. I hope that you have your study guide available. I hope that you have your pen available. I hope that, of course, I just showed you my Kleenex, my hand sanitizer, and I am getting empty. Yeah, I may have to call in my faithful technical support, Mrs. Horton, to bring me another. She doesn't like it that I drink Diet Coke Zero. I mean, come on, I don't drink beer, tequila, or anything like that. Anyway, so yes, let's continue. We are talking about the results from World War I. I mean, the AP Euro exam does not focus on battles and things like that. It talks about results. It talks about what became of the war going forward. Peace treaties are always more important than the war itself. But let's look at their Great War. And I think I went over a little bit about this the other day. Yes, they were called the Lost Generation. Once again, there were entire towns in Great Britain, in France, and Germany, in particular Russia, that following the war were totally devoid of male populations between the ages of 17 and 50. It was a interesting situation. Then, of course, and this is not even the results I'm talking about here. I'm going to be talking about here in my study guide. There was the Great Flu Pandemic, which we talked about briefly. The flu pandemic was so prevalent that little kids even made a song about it. Do you remember the Black Death? Ring around the roses, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. Yeah, that was. But the children during the great 1918-1919 flu pandemic, let me see. I had a little birdie. Its name was Enza. I opened the window and in flew Enza. They would sing that when they would jump ropes. Interesting, yes. So anyway, the Great War had the following consequences. 4 million soldiers dead and 8.3 million wounded during amongst the Central Powers. 5.4 million dead and touching the face again. I can't stop it. 5.4 million dead and 7 million wounded soldiers. Now we're talking about soldiers. From now they're called the Allies. When they began this war, they were known as the Triple Entente. Now they are the Allies, and the Germans, the Austrians, and the Ottoman Empire are called the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austrian Empire were dismembered. It means they were taken apart. Russia lost lots of territory. Germany lost a significant amount of territory. It was made into Poland, for example. And the Austrian Empire was broken up. In fact, once again, when I toured Poland, when I toured the Czech Republic, when I toured Hungary, all of those countries in 2018 were celebrating their 100th anniversary. Thank you to World War I. Americans entered the war and into European affairs like they never had before. For nearly 100 years, the Monroe Doctrine had been the cornerstone of American foreign policy. And if you recall the Monroe Doctrine, the promise at the end of the Monroe Doctrine was that the United States would stay out of purely European affairs. Well, that ended with World War I. And not only did it end World War I, even though the United States in the next decade went into a period of isolationism, they're coming back. The United States will be coming back, and now, no country can really afford, particularly not the United States, cannot afford to ignore the events that are going on in Europe, as the United States tried to. So the United States entered into the war and into European affairs like never before, and scratching the face, and that is going to continue. Then there was the collapse not only of the Russian Empire, but of the dynasty, the Tsarist dynasty. And that collapse of the Russian Empire, the Russian government, brought communism. World War I opened the door for communism. And I've said this a zillion times before. Karl Marx, when he invented this thing called communism, never envisioned that communism would take place in Russia. He thought it would take place in the industrial countries, Germany, Great Britain, Belgium, to a lesser degree, the United States, industrial countries that had large working class populations. And I'm going to use that term again. Russia in 1918 was a big fat farm. and the great majority of the Russian people were peasant farmers. And the idea that communism would begin there in that country, and that the second country to accept communism would be China. Karl Marx never saw that coming. Anyway, now World War I will also bring fascism to Spain first, Italy next, and finally Germany, because of basically World War I just destroys the order, the balance that had existed prior to 1914. And it is widely agreed amongst historians that World War I was the mother of World War II and most of the horrors for the rest of the 20th century. I mean, you can trace the Balkan Wars of the 1980s, the Bosnian genocide to World War I. Now, and finally, Europe was no longer the center of the universe. Europe was no longer the center of the world. A part of the world that was now free to interfere when it wished or to ignore the world if it chose. Okay, let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles. There used to be a History Channel series back when you remember. Well, you don't remember. The History Channel is about the time you were born, sold its soul. But the History Channel used to actually just do nothing but talk about history. And one of the series it had on was History's Blunders. And one of those blunders that it talked about in there is Treaty of Versailles as a whole. But anyway, the Treaty of Versailles was, of course, it took place in Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles was hammered out in the first half of 1918. It was dominated by, hopefully you have your study guide, 4 individuals. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, interesting character in many ways. Pardon me, I'm going to sneeze. Interesting character in many ways. To be real honest, I'm going to sneeze now. To be real honest, Woodrow Wilson was a dried-in-the-wool racist. I mean, history paints him as an idealist, and I guess in many ways he was. He was a believer in democracy, and that he was a believer in crusades. He was the son of a minister. He was idealistic. He had just lost his wife and had married a new woman. And so, yeah, he was from the world of academia. He had been president of Princeton University in New Jersey before he became governor of New Jersey, and then jettisoned into the White House. That he won the election for president in 1912. And then Woodrow Wilson ran again in 1916 under the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war." Pardon me. I'm so sorry. But don't worry about your teacher. It is allergies and not the COVID-19. And if you remember, COVID-19 has a dry cough. This is just me sneezing all morning. So anyway, Woodrow Wilson, interesting character, he was a believer in self-determination. He was a believer that ethnicities should be able to rule themselves. He was a believer, in fact, and I've talked about this before, if you were to have, traveled throughout, particularly Eastern Europe, into the houses, the little tiny hovels that people lived in, little farmers in places like Hungary and the Czech Republic and Poland. You would go into these humble homes, and above the fireplace, there would be, a picture taken out of a newspaper of Woodrow Wilson, and they would have that above the fireplace because he was looked upon as such a hero. And I sent you the picture when I visited the Czech Republic, Prague, in 2018. We took a train into the Czech Republic, and we get right out of the train station in Prague, and just the way that everybody exits the train station and enter the street. And before we go to the street, there's this statue of 20, 30 feet tall of none other than Woodrow Wilson. It has 4 placards, talking about him in the train station in downtown downtown Prague. It has these, memorials to Woodrow Wilson. Interestingly enough, of course, that statue was destroyed in World War II. No, I'm sorry. The statue was destroyed by your friendly neighborhood Soviet Union during the communist era, but then it was rebuilt. When the communists were kicked out in 1991, they rebuilt the statue. There are many parts of Europe that owe their, or believe they owe their existence to Woodrow Wilson. Perhaps that's true. On the other hand, we got to tell the whole truth about everybody, I would like to think. Woodrow Wilson was a racist, end of story. When he was president of the United States, particularly during World War I and right after World War I, lynchings of African Americans were still a thing that was done in the South. It was done fairly commonly. The Ku Klux Klan, the American South in the early part of this century was not a friendly place. Was not exactly a friendly place for African Americans. In fact, that's so facetious, it's ugly. Friendly. It was apartheid. It was worse than apartheid. It was oppression of African Americans. Yes, slavery officially ended in the United States in 1865, but after that, this Jim Crow period arose, which included not just not being able to go to white restaurants, but it also included things like the South had worked out a way that if they needed work done on roads or things of that nature, a sheriff would simply go about and see African American males and snatch them up on some trumped up charge of a crime and put them in jail, and then they would have to go out and work on the roads. And, you say, well, eventually wouldn't it end? Well, not necessarily, because say, for example, that African American was digging with a shovel, and that shovel somehow mysteriously got broke. Well, you have to pay for that shovel. But I can't. The African American person not have any money. And he said, well, we'll just tack on some more time. And yeah, that happened a lot. And when the lynchings came about, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, appealed to Woodrow Wilson and said, look, these people are being murdered in the American South. And Wilson said, well, that's a problem for the states to handle. And the state governments in the Deep South, they really weren't too sympathetic. And I've gotten way off the subject. Yes, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, President of the United States, was one of the big 4. David Lloyd George, we've mentioned him before. He is the Prime Minister of Britain. David Lloyd George, as you're writing down, David Lloyd George ran for election for Prime Minister of Britain, and his campaign slogan was that he promised to squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeaked at the Treaty of Versailles. So, pardon me. He's not going to be too sympathetic. And then there was George Clemenceau. George Clemenceau of France, the president of France. They called him the Old Tiger. I don't know where that came from. Perhaps he served in the early days of the Franco-Prussian War. I don't know. But yeah, they called him the Old Tiger, and he really had it out for Woodrow Wilson. See, because Woodrow Wilson did. Woodrow Wilson came to the Treaty of Versailles with his 14 points, his plan for peace, which was actually very idealistic. And Clemenceau, his primary goal was to make the Germans pay for war. And Woodrow Wilson, of course, kind of stood in the way of that. Clemenceau never got tired of making fun of Woodrow Wilson. And also, between the British and the French, there was a spirit of negativism, cynicism against the Americans, because after all, the United States entered the war in 1917, don't really start arriving until 1918. Most of the fighting and dying had been done by the time the Americans showed up. And so, for this upstart president from across the Atlantic to come up and try to tell them how to do things, they really weren't too receptive. But yeah. And Clemenceau, every time Woodrow Wilson brings up his 14 points, Clemenceau would start saying, oh, 14 points, 14 points, 14 points. Didn't you know, Mr. President, that God only has 10? Reference to the 10 Commandments, of course. And then Vittorio Emanuele Orlando for the president of Italy. His role actually in making the Treaty of Versailles will not be as he actually will not feel good about his role in the Treaty of Versailles. He, in fact, Italy's going to feel cheated. They will not get what they want out of the Treaty of Versailles. And what the Italians wanted, among other things, was colonial property. And they also wanted some of the territory on the eastern coast of the Adriatic, Trieste, some of the Italian territories that became part of Bosnia, the new Yugoslavia that was created. So let's get back to this. The Big Four, yeah, we know those guys now. Their job was much more difficult than that of the Congress of Vienna a century earlier. For example, the Vienna Congress of 1815, the one that had established Europe for the entire 19th century, Vienna Conference concerned only Europe. There wasn't there was a United States of America, but they were a non-player. And there wasn't a China, there wasn't, Japan, none of these far-flung colonies, far-flung countries and ethnicities. In the Napoleonic Wars, France admitted defeat. They surrendered. And Napoleon III abdicated. And here's the big thing was the Vienna Congress of 1815. They had newspapers, but not a whole lot of people could read. And even if they could read, most of the governments of Europe in 1815 were still monarchies. And so this thing called public opinion didn't really matter a whole lot to the signers of the Congress of Vienna. But in 1918, public opinion was a thing. And the peoples of France and Britain, they wanted their vengeance. They wanted their pound of flesh. And so, yeah, it was more difficult. So this conference was much different. Public opinion did matter in a world of democracies. And nationalism in Europe had become almost like a secular religion. And the many ethnic groups of Europe could not be counted on anymore to remain quiet. World War I had been transformed into some sort of moral crusade for a just peace as well as a secure one. And to be real honest, they got neither. So the 14 points had emphasized self-determination, which was at best a pipe dream given the current map of Europe. Wilson's idealism also came into direct confrontation with the practical war aims and secret deals that had been cut during the war. You say, what does that mean? So Wilson came to the Treaty of Versailles, has his 14 points in his briefcase, and the 14 points are very idealistic, hey, let's all join hands and sing Kumbaya. Let's all create all new democracies, and let's let's create this new international Congress, and we'll call it the League of Nations. And at the League of Nations, everyone will come and they'll sit down and they'll discuss their differences, and the lion and the lamb will sit down together, and it will be perfect. And so that was his idealism. That idealism, though, came into direct confrontation with the practical realities, meaning that the British and French leaders in particular had promised their populations, Germany's going to pay for this war, both in terms of territory, in terms of government, but also in terms of money. In fact, going into the 1920s, most Britain and France will pretty much hamstring their economies to payments that the Germans were supposed to make, reparations. And considering the fact that Germany had just been beaten down like they stole something, the Germans really weren't in that kind of shape to pay them that kind of money. But anyway, and that was what Wilson was running into. Realism, practical war aims, secret deals. Yeah, the British and the French and the victors had cut deals after the war that they were going to put themselves into advantageous positions regarding the treaty. So the populace of Britain and France have been told that the Germans would pay monetarily for the war. We went over that. Russia had been promised Constantinople. Russia had originally been promised Constantinople in this war. That's what they always wanted, the Dardanelles, an outlet from the Black Sea into the Aegean, into the Mediterranean, in return for France's acquisition of the Alsace-Lorraine, which France got back the Alsace-Lorraine, and British control of Egypt. But of course, Russia is not going to get that because they lost. Romania had been promised part of Hungary, and then some agreements conflicted with others. Italy and Serbia had conflicting claims on the islands in the Adriatic and on the shoreline of the Adriatic. Italy wanted that eastern shoreline because the people who lived there at the time were mostly Italian. The British also had encouraged Arab aspirations for independence from the Ottoman Empire. When Britain went in, Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, went into Saudi Arabia and said, hey, if you guys help us fight the Turks, after the war, you'll get independence. But that agreement with the Arabs had went against the Balfour Declaration, Balfour. In the Balfour Declaration, the British had also promised Jews a home state right slap dab in the middle of Arab Middle East, in what we now call what we now call Israel. And so the British basically talked out of two sides of their heads so they could get Arab help. The British and the French also agreed to divide what we now call the Middle East, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, between themselves. Now, France was very cognizant of the fact that it had fewer people than Germany, and that gap, in other words, the French population was going to continue to fall further and further behind, given the low French birth rate, so that the French wanted to do everything in their power to make the Germans be weak long into the future. And so basically what France was going to do in the Treaty of Versailles was to place their boot on the throat of Germany and press. And yeah. Italy continued to desire, there's that word again, Italia irredenta, meaning irredeemable Italy, meaning an Italian empire. That would include not only, of course, what today we think of Italy, but also not only the coastline of the Adriatic, but also an Italian empire in Africa. The Italians had switched sides in the middle of World War I, believing that this side will win and it's going to make us an empire, going to make us great like in the days of the Roman Empire. The British, of course, want to continue to expand their empire. You know, many people are great fans of Winston Churchill. Many people are big fans of Winston Churchill, and yet they forget Winston Churchill was an imperialist. In the bottom of it all, Winston Churchill was an imperialist. He believed in the British Empire, and the British Empire was sucking its living out of countries like India and South Africa and Singapore, Hong Kong. The British were making cash money out of those countries. But anyway, now Japan also wanted their empire. Japan believed that in getting into this war on the side of Britain and France and the other countries, that in the end, that they were going to get paid off after the war was over with. They were going to be getting all those German possessions in the Pacific, which they didn't. They believed that they would be given a free reign in Manchuria, which they didn't. To be real honest, they didn't give the Japanese anything. And, of course, giving it to them meant that they would be giving foreign territory to the Japanese. But the Japanese were like, hey, we did our part. Where is our payback? And the simple reason why the founders of the Treaty of Versailles didn't give Japan anything, pure racism. And it's pure racism. They didn't trust the Japanese. The Japanese were still considered the yellow peril. And so, yeah. Anyway. But all the Japanese were doing, and I'm not defending what they did, and yet you have to consider this, all's fair in love and war. All the Japanese were doing over the next 20 years is creating a Japanese empire just like the British did. And see, that's just it. The Japanese figured they were going to copy the West, and they wanted to copy the most successful empire in the world. The most successful empire in the world were the British. And the Japanese were going to copy their empire and make it a Japanese empire. We're going to talk about that more in a future chapter. The United States, however, insisted on freedom of navigation and the Monroe Doctrine, which the Monroe Doctrine is an imperialist doctrine. Say again, the Monroe Doctrine, which was proffered in 1820 by President James Monroe, was an imperialist doctrine. Why? Because the Monroe Doctrine, nowhere in the Monroe Doctrine did it say that the United States of America itself would not bother the countries of Central and South America, which it has many times. All right. And then there was the rise of Bolshevism and communism. Those things didn't exist prior to World War I. And so, they were another thing that had to be looked at. The Allies, right after World War I, including the United States of America, had tried to send armies into Russia to thwart the Bolsheviks. In other words, they invaded Russia. We don't write about this in history. You don't see it in American history very much. We don't talk about it. But yeah, right after World War I, the British, the French, and even the Germans and the United States sent soldiers into Russia on an ill-fated mission to destroy communism. And if you wonder why the Russians to this day don't really trust us, don't really trust the West, we'll talk about this more later on. But remember that from the Russian perspective, if you look at history, Russia has been invaded a total of 4 times from the West. There was the Great Northern War where Sweden tried to invade them. There was Napoleonic Wars where Napoleon tried to invade them. There was World War I where the Germans pushed deep into Russian territory. And then there was World War II, all of which Western countries invaded Russia. And, so yeah. And, oh yes, and then of course this little thing after the founding of the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks in Russia, and I'm not defending them, but this is from the Russian perspective. The British, the French, the Americans, they invaded Russia, unsuccessfully, but yeah. And so from the Russian perspective, yeah, it wasn't a good thing. So anyway, the communists also tried to set up governments both in Bavaria, in Germany, and Hungary. Berlin had a communist uprising led by an organization that was called the Spartacus Group. The Allies supported the suppression of such activities with force. They even allowed German volunteers to fight against the Bolsheviks in the Balkan states. Communism did arouse some attention, but it was the fear of the rise of Germany again that dominated the conference. Yeah, I mean, they were afraid that Germany was coming back. Give me a second. I'm going to check on how we're doing for time. Okay, 35 minutes. Let's put that away. So, Roman numeral 25. The Treaty of Versailles consisted of 5 separate treaties between the victors, primarily the British and French, and the defeated nations, primarily Germany. Oh yeah, the other nations, they were dealt with as well, but the one that got hammered were the Germans. Excuse me. I know, unprofessional. Okay. Woodrow Wilson arrived at the conference in the middle of a lot of people cheered him on the streets of Paris, and optimism that, not just in France, but also in Germany, also in the eastern countries of Europe, that he would provide a new international order that would bring peace and justice and self-determination for all. And he came with this plan, once again, called the 14 points. Now, let me break down the 14 points for you into 4 primary points. What were the 14 points? Number 1, open treaties. That means that from now on, there will be no secret deals, no more, Zimmerman notes where, Germany promised to help Germany promised Mexico the western third of the United States if they were involved. And no more, like, for example, the British cut deals with, the Arabs, but also the Jews, and basically promised them the same thing, homelands, independent countries. No more secret arrangements, open treaties, openly arrived at. All treaties would take place in the open and be published, and everybody could see what was going on. Service, right? 2, freedom of trade and navigation. Yeah, one of the things that started this war, of course, is money. One of the big bones of contention was being able to trade in China. Woodrow Wilson said, hey, why don't we just let everybody trade freely? Why don't we just let the country that has the best deal buy and sell goods to other countries? It's called freedom of trade and navigation. Everybody should have the right to sell their products, and if the other country has a better deal for selling their products, then they get to sell their products. Number 3, self-determination. Yeah, see, this is why. This is the thing that made Wilson a hero in Eastern Europe. Self-determination. Self-determination. The idea, and the word self and determination. The idea that every country, every ethnicity should be able to have their own country. That Ireland should be independent, that Poles should be ruled by a Polish government. The Czechs should have their own government, although after the war they were combined with their brother Slovaks into what became known as Czechoslovakia. Even though they were both Slavic, but they didn't really like each other. Hungarian should be ruled in a Hungarian government, etc., etc., etc. And so, yeah, that was the third thing. And finally, The fourth thing, and once again, there were 14 points that I summed them up for you in four. League of Nations. League, a League of Nations. See, Woodrow Wilson was a giant believer in the power of democracy, the power of reasonable minds to sit down together and to work out differences and to avoid conflicts through negotiation. He was a big believer in this. He believed in creating an international Congress that would, when two countries had a dispute, they would come to this thing called the League of Nations, bring their dispute before the League of Nations, talk about it, discuss it. Other countries could help offer solutions instead of going to war. And that was it. In fact, going forward, Woodrow Wilson will put so much faith into this League of Nations that all the other 14 points are going to be voted down. All of them. All of them will be voted down. All of them will be struck down. Clemenceau of France will just make fun of him to no great end. And all of them will be struck down. But Woodrow Wilson was able to get the League of Nations idea through. And he had so much faith in this idea of sitting down and talking about things that Woodrow Wilson accepted. And he said, all right, okay, well, I'll take, we can work this all out later. If you just get the League of Nations, we'll all sit down, and eventually all those other things I talked about, we'll implement them later. No, it didn't happen quite that way. And we'll talk about its failure later on, but, spoiler alert, the League of Nations will, and the entire Treaty of Versailles will not fly back in the United States of America. Spoiler alert, the United States didn't sign the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson signed it. But as you know, when a president signs a treaty, that treaty must be ratified or written off or agreed to by a 2/3 majority of the Senate. And the Senate, after World War I, just wasn't in the mood to get into an international agreement with the rest of the world. And so, nope, didn't bite. And the League of Nations, the United States never joined, which was probably a great weakness for the League of Nations, but no, the United States never joined. And so, but the point of the matter was, during this peace talks, Woodrow Wilson, his 14 points got shot down, but they accepted the League of Nations. And Wilson thought that was enough. Okay, so getting back to our study guide here. Open covenants, openly arrived at. That's the first term. Open treaties, open covenants. Openly arrived at soon gave way to cynicism. So-called peace without victors, which was a motto of Wilson, without peace without victors, soon became a mockery when both Germany and Russia were not only, dealt harshly with in this treaty, they were excluded. Yeah, and this treaty is going to say, Germany, you're going to take this, this, and this. And Germany and Russia were totally excluded from the negotiations. They couldn't even witness. They couldn't have a voice in a treaty that was going to determine their future for the next 20 years going forward. And so, the Germans were basically handed a deal and is expected to sign it. National self-determination was cast aside in favor of practicality and cynicism. And to be real honest, self-determination in a place like Europe is a pipe dream because, there were pockets of ethnicities scattered all throughout Europe. It would be very difficult to create an ethnic Slavic state because there were pockets of Slavs and, and other ethnicities scattered here, there, and yonder. It would have created literally a patchwork quilt of countries, impractical all across Europe. So Wilson went from being a hero to being a goat, and goat does not mean greatest of all time. Goat means the kind that, as he had to abandon each one of his ideas in the face of practicality. So, Wilson, I sound like the movie Castaway, don't I? Yes. I'm checking the time. Don't want to go over too much here. Wilson put great faith in his idea for a League of Nations, which he felt would solve all the problems left over by the treaty. The League was not to be an international government, but a body of sovereign states that agreed to pursue common policies and to consult in the common interest, especially when war threatened. Refusal to abide by resolutions of the League of Nations would mean economic sanctions and perhaps even military intervention. Problem with that was that the League of Nations had no military forces that it could command. However, any such action also would require a unanimous consent of its council, which consisted permanently of Britain, Japan, France, Italy, and the United States. 5, as well as 4 temporary members, which is quite ironic because the United States in the end won't join the convention. The covenant of the League bound its members to respect and preserve the territorial integrity of all its members, which was generally seen as a directive to preserve what had been won through war by the victor nations. You understand? And so, respect and preserve the territorial integrity of all its members, which was, meaning what the winners had won through war. And the exclusion of Germany and the new Soviet Union. Soviet Union will be born in 1921, but we may as well get used to that name, Soviet Union, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That's what Russia becomes. Communist Russia will become no longer Russia, but the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. 4 words. Because in the Soviet Union or the USSR, there's not one ethnicity, there's not one country, but there's actually 15, forgive me. 15. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, countries like that. Anyway, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. It was an empire. It was a new Russian empire. Russia was the biggest of the 15. So forgive me for going off on that, but may as well use the word Soviet Union. The exclusion of Germany and the Soviet Union from the League also undermined its claim to even-handedness and being credible. How can you exclude the biggest country on earth and also the country that has the largest number of people in Western Europe, Germany, and call yourself a legitimately representative body? I mean, that would be like the United States the United States Congress claiming to represent all the people of the United States except for California. They're in the United States, Congress represents them, but their delegates are not allowed. And so, okay. Why don't we end here? And we will pick up again tomorrow with Roman numeral 27. Please add comments to anything that you see, any questions. I'm looking on my live chat line and I don't see comments, and it's making me want to cry. But that's okay. I have 7 viewers, but I'm sure more will join. Have a good day, and I will come back tomorrow. And please wash your hands, social distancing. I mean, do what your political leaders say. It's one day we'll be through this, but we've all got to make really small sacrifices. And I know you're bored out of your mind. I know you want to hang out with your friends, but do the right thing. Yeah, do the right thing, guys, because if we do the right thing more quickly, we'll get through this. And forgive me, I'm gonna sneeze. You know, and this is why, goodness, this is why I can't have class. I'd be sneezing all day, and who knows? Maybe I do have the virus. You know, and I wouldn't know it for 14 days, and then I sneeze, and there you are. Because my sneezes are powerful, very powerful, like a cannon. Anyway, have a great day. Take care of yourselves. Bye now.